Hello mathematicians! Today we're going to be learning about whole numbers, more specifically how to subtract with whole numbers. So to start us off, we're going to do an example that does not require that we borrow or regroup. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means in our next slide. So to start us off, we have 29,843 minus 8,632. And to make our lives a little easier, we're going to use a place value chart, because remember that when we add or subtract whole numbers, we do have to line up our place values. So now that my numbers are lined up, we're going to start off with our smallest place value, which in this case is our ones. Then we'll move on to our tens, our hundreds, and so on. So in our ones place value, we have 3 minus 2. And 3 minus 2 is simply 1. And then if we move on to our tens place value, we have 4 minus 3, which is also equal to 1. And then going on to our hundreds place value, we have 8 minus 6. And 8 minus 6 is equal to 2. So we're going to write our 2 there. Then moving on to our thousands, we have 9 minus 8. And 9 minus 8 is equal to 1. And then finally, moving on to our 10,000s place value, we have 2 minus nothing. Now, if you'd like to add a 0 there to make it easier, you definitely can, but you do not have to, because 2 minus nothing is simply equal to 2. Alright? So 29,843 minus 8,632 is equal to 21,211. Alright? So now we are going to do an example that does require for us to borrow and regroup, and we'll talk about what that means. Alright? So this example is going to be 725,123 minus 13,987. Again, to make our lives easier, here we have our place value chart, and we're going to start off with the ones. So in our ones place value, we have 3 minus 7. Now, if it was just 3 minus 7, we would end up with a negative number. However, because there are values in front of the 3, we're able to borrow from them and regroup our numbers. So this is what it's going to look like. So looking at the number before the 3, we have a 2 in the tens place. So what we can do is we could cross out that 2 and make it a 1. Essentially what we're doing is we're borrowing 10 from the tens place value, and we're regrouping it here in our ones place value. So instead of having a 3, we have a 13, because we borrowed 10 from the tens place value. So now we have 13 minus 7, and we're able to do that very easily because 13 minus 7 is equal to 6. And then we're going to move on to our tens place value. And now we have 1 minus 8, so we're going to do the same thing. We're going to borrow. So we're going to borrow from our hundreds place value, and this 1 is going to become a 0. Alright? And then the 1 in the tens place is going to become an 11. So here I have 11 minus 8, and 11 minus 8 is equal to 3. And now if we move on to our hundreds place value, we have 0 minus 9. So again, we're going to have to borrow. So we're going to borrow from the thousands place. So this 5 is now going to become a 4. And that 0 is going to become a 10. So now we have 10 minus 9, which is equal to 1. Alright? So we're going to move on to our next place value, and now we have 4 minus 3. Now here we don't have to borrow because 4 minus 3 is simply 1. Alright? Then we're going to move on to our 10,000s place value. And here we have 2 minus 1, which is just equal to 1. And then finally we have 7 minus nothing, or you can add a 0 there if it's easier, and 7 minus nothing is 7. Alright? So 725,123 minus 13,987 is equal to 711,136. Alright? So here we have two more examples, and this time instead of using our place value chart, we're going to go ahead and just line them up as you see here. The place values are lined up, and we're just going to subtract as we were doing before. So for our first example, we have 43,782 minus 8,932. So starting with our ones place value, we're going to do 2 minus 2. And 2 minus 2 is equal to 0. Then moving on, we're going to do 8 minus 3, and 8 minus 3 is equal to 5. Then moving on, we have 7 minus 9. And now again, if we just had 7 minus 9, it would be a negative value, but since we're able to borrow here, that's exactly what we're going to do. So we're going to borrow from the 3. So that means we're going to cross out the 3 and make that a 2. And now that 7 becomes 17. So 17 minus 9 is equal to 8. And then if we go to our next place value, we have 2 minus 8. And again, we're going to have to borrow. We're going to borrow from the 4. That 4 is going to become 3. And that 2 is going to become a 12. And so 12 minus 8 is equal to 4. And then finally, we're going to move on to our last place value. And here we have 3 minus nothing. And 3 minus nothing is simply 3. Don't forget that because our number is larger than 1,000, we do have to add a comma or commas sometimes. So make sure you include it there. So 43,782 minus 8,932 is equal to 34,850. All right? So let's move on to our next problem. In our ones place value, we have 0 minus 2. And here, we're going to have to borrow. However, if we're going to try borrowing from the tens place, notice that there's a 0 there. So we're not able to borrow from the tens place, so we're going to have to look at the hundreds place. And in the hundreds place, we have a 6, and so we're able to borrow from there. So this 6 becomes a 5. And first, we're going to have to borrow for tens place and then for ones place. So our tens place becomes a 10. But then we're going to have to borrow for our ones place, so we're going to cross that out, make it a 9. And then our 0 in the ones place becomes a 10. And 10 minus 2 is equal to 8. And then we're going to go ahead and keep subtracting. 9 minus 5 is equal to 4. 5 minus 4 is equal to 1. And then 2 minus 8, here we're going to have to borrow from the 9. And that 9 is going to become an 8. And then that 2 is going to become a 12. So 12 minus 8 is equal to 4. And then finally, we're going to move on to that last place value. And 8 minus nothing is simply equal to 8. And don't forget to add your comma. So 92,600 minus 8,452 is equal to 84,148. So here we're going to do our final example. We have 1,000 minus 752. And now the 1,000 has 30 zeros. So when we subtract, we're actually going to have to borrow from the thousands place. Because, if we can borrow, then we're going to borrow for 0 minus 2. So we're going to cross out that 1. First, we're going to borrow for our hundreds place. So that 1 becomes a 0. The 0 in the hundreds place becomes a 10. We're going to cross that out and make it a 9, so we could then borrow for our tens place value. And so the 0 in the tens place value becomes a 10, but then we're going to have to borrow for our ones place value. So that 10 becomes a 9. And finally, that 0 at the end becomes a 10. So we have 10 minus 2, which is equal to 8. Then we're going to move on to our next place value, 9 minus 5. And 9 minus 5 is equal to 4. And then we have 9 minus 7, which is equal to 2. And here we are done, because in our thousands place value, we have 0. And 0 minus 0 is just 0. So we don't have to include that there. All right? Another way to do this problem is because we have to borrow so much and because there are so many zeros, what we can do is we can take away 1 from each value. So instead of having 1,000 minus 752, if we take away 1 from 1,000, we have 999. And if we take away 1 from 752, we have 751. And so taking 1 from each value makes sure that they are still balanced, but it helps us out because now we don't have so many zeros and now we're not going to end up having to borrow. So let's see how this goes. 9 minus 1 is equal to 8. 9 minus 5 is equal to 4. 9 minus 7 is equal to 2. And I didn't have to borrow. So if you ever have a value that has a bunch of zeros and you know you're going to have to borrow a lot, you can take 1 away from each value to make it a little easier to subtract, all right? And one final note, for addition, we're able to switch our values and still end up with the same sum. However, for subtraction, if you switch your values when you are subtracting, you're going to get a completely different value after you subtract. So we're only able to switch our values for addition, but not for subtraction, so please don't do so. All right? And that's it for subtracting with whole numbers.